Hi, good afternoon, boys and girls. I am here today with the story that I'm going to read for you. The story is called Albert, and it's about a man and a little bird that builds a nest. And then I have some nests here that I'm going to show you. So that should be kind of fun. We have a couple different kinds, and we'll take a good look at them. But we'll start reading the book. The title of the story, or the name of the story, is Albert. That's written on the front cover. And the author, her name is Donna Jo Napoli, and the illustrator is Jim LaMarche. The dog is gonna run. I wonder if we should go get him. Maggie says no. Okay, so here we go. Albert. This is a fiction story, which tells us that it's not a true story. And as we're reading, you'll discover how we know it's not true. Albert sat at his table and drank tomato juice and listened to the noises of the morning. The people in the apartment above clattered downstairs and out the door on their way to work. The dog next door barked hello to everyone who passed. Children giggled on their way to school. These were good noises. Albert stood up and worked his hand out between the grill work over the window. He wanted to check the weather. The garbage truck rumbled by. That wasn't a good noise. Albert shook his head. Too cold, he said. He shut the window and rubbed his hands together to warm them. Then he sat down and read the comic strip. The next day, Albert ate lunch and listened to the noises of midday. The mailman sang as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. The snack vendor shouted out the day's special, golden bean cakes. The flower lady laughed with her customers. Good noises today, very good noises. Albert went to the window and reached his hand toward the maple tree. How was the weather today? Two men walked past arguing. Now that wasn't a good noise. Too damp. Albert shut the window and wiped his hands on his trousers. Then he took out a pack of cards and did card tricks. The next day, Albert said, too hot. And the next day, too breezy. Albert told himself that when the weather was just right, he would put on his hat and go for a walk. And every day the weather seemed good at first, but after a moment more, it turned out the weather was never just right. So Albert listened to baseball games on the radio and cut pictures out of magazines and wrote postcards that he never mailed. Then, one sunny day, Albert stuck his hand out the window, and the next thing he knew, a twig appeared on it. Albert looked around in surprise. A cardinal flew by and dropped in another twig, and then there were two cardinals, a bright red male and a brown-yellow female, and both of them were dropping twig after twig. Albert watched, dumbfounded, as his now cupped hand filled to the brim. The cardinals fluttered and fussed and poked and pulled. They heaped grasses into the center of the twigs. Finally, the female shaped the nest to fit her breast, and she settled in. Albert stared at her. Excuse me, but my arm's not a branch. But the cardinal didn't even look at him. She flew off, leaving a nest of 4 tiny eggs in Albert's hand. With his free hand, Albert scratched his head. If he pulled his arm in, twisting it to get back through the grill work, the nest would surely fall apart. So he stood there. The mother cardinal returned. Albert stood with his arms out the window. Mrs. Cardinal, I think you picked a poor spot to build a nest. But the cardinal just whistled and fell asleep. That night, Albert slept standing up. Do you think that really could happen? I don't think so. This is how we know it's really not a true story. A cardinal bird would never build a nest on a person's hand. And do you think someone would stand up and sleep all night long? The next day the mother cardinal kept the eggs warm while the father cardinal fed her. Albert rubbed his aching neck. "Listen, I hate to disappoint you two, but I'm sure this is not going to work." The cardinals looked at Albert. Then they preened each other. That night Albert slept standing up again. The third day Albert rotated his shoulders to get the kinks out. The mother bird flew to the ground and pecked at a grub. Albert took a good look at the eggs for the first time. Perfect sea blue ovals with red-brown spots. The father bird flew down and chattered at the mother bird, and she flew back to the eggs and sat on them. "Pretty eggs," Albert said gently. The cardinal gave a quizzical chirp. Day after day, Albert stood the nest in his hand. He began each day by watching the birds, and then he looked around. Once a plane roared overhead. Albert's first urge was to pull his arm in and shut the window, but the nest kept him there. So he watched the plane until it went out of sight, and soon he found himself dreaming about the places those passengers were going to visit, and he smiled. Once a man and a woman came out of a building yelling. They turned their backs on each other and both walked off in a huff. Albert wanted to pull his arm in and shut the window, but the nest was there, so he stayed put. About an hour later, the man appeared from one direction and the woman appeared from the other. Each held a wrapped present. They laughed and they hugged. Albert dreamed about what might be in those presents, and then he smiled again. Albert didn't only dream. Whenever the mother cardinal hopped off the nest, even for a moment, Albert breathed his hot breath onto the eggs to warm them. And once, when the mother cardinal was away, a cat walked along the ledge beneath Albert's arm. It flicked its tail and looked up curiously. It crouched, ready to spring. Albert screeched. The cat ran off, and Albert chuckled. And he was worried for those eggs. A week passed, and one morning when Albert opened his mouth, he peeped. The father cardinal looked at him askance, but Albert peeped insistently. The cardinal flew off, and he returned with a beetle. Now, a beetle is what was the grub. Beetle eggs are called grubs, and I know that my class, when we're out on the playground, we like to dig down in the dirt, and they're teeny tiny little creatures. They look like small, fat, white-colored worms, almost, is what they look like, but they're real tiny. But they, that's the egg or the larva form of a beetle. The cardinal flew off, and he returned with a beetle. Albert wrinkled his nose and jerked his head away. The cardinal ate the beetle, and then he flew off again, and this time he returned with a blackberry. That sounds better, doesn't it? Albert ate it gratefully, and from that day on, Albert peeped, and the father cardinal fed him blackberries, and Albert smiled at the noises all around him. Days passed. On the 12th morning, Albert spied a crack in one of the eggs. He put his face to the grill work so he could see everything perfectly. The second egg cracked, and the third, and the fourth. The baby birds pecked their way out, wet and scraggly. "Good work," Albert smiled. "Welcome." Now, looking here at these two cardinals, the red cardinal is the daddy cardinal, or the male cardinal, and this one that's kind of brown and orange with a little bit of red up here, that is the female cardinal, or the mama. And when you're thinking about birds, the male bird is always more colorful than the female bird. In the next few weeks, the mother and father cardinals fed their brood, including Albert, who learned to love seeds and berries and even, eventually, beetles. The mother sat on Albert's wrist and sang her joy. The father flew to the top of the maple and sang his pride. The parents whistled to the fledglings, encouraging them to test their wings. Soon, the first fledgling, or baby bird, left the nest, then the second, and then the third. But one stayed. He hopped up Albert's arm and pecked at his nose. He looked worriedly at the ground. "Go for it, birdie," said Albert. "Fly." The fledgling looked down again. He kept his wings close to his body. Albert stuck out his hand in front of the fledgling. "Come on," he said. "Give it a try." The fledgling jumped into the hat. Albert tossed him up lightly. He fluttered a little and landed safely back in the hat with a peep. Albert tossed him higher. He fluttered a lot and landed back in the hat with a loud chirp. Albert tossed him high, 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 and the fledgling looked around and spread his wings, and he flew to the maple tree and whistled. Albert smiled and whistled back. The nest sat empty in Albert's hand. He looks really tired, doesn't he? Look, his hair has gotten longer. His little whiskers have grown, all that time standing there. He drew his arm in through the grillwork and the nest fell. Albert looked at the grass and the trees and the sky. He listened to laughter nearby, a good noise, and the siren of an ambulance far off, a bad noise. And Albert knew now that both were part of this big, wonderful world. He put his face up to the grillwork and felt the wind and the sun on his cheeks. "Just right," he said. Albert smoothed his hair and he brushed off his hat. After so long, he hardly looked like himself. He went outside for a walk. Now Albert walks often, and sometimes, just sometimes, when no one's looking, he flies. The end. Now, hopefully you can hear some of the birds around us outside making all the different noises that they make. I have some bird nests here that I'm going to show to you. And the first I'm going to show you cardinal nests. I'm going to take them out of this. I have had these for a couple of years, and so I keep them wrapped in these so that they stay safe because they are delicate, which means they can break apart easily. But I want you to see this one. And let's take a look on the inside of the nest. It's not very deep, but it's kind of soft. And this one has some of the evergreen limbs and what we would call some twigs that the birds can find in the yard. If we look underneath the bottom, there are these long pieces of dried grass that they've used, and they kind of weave them together to sort of make a basket. And I have another one that's also a cardinal nest that I'll show you. Hopefully we'll be back at school sometime soon, and then I can bring them out. Now this one is a little bit deeper and thicker. It's newer. I haven't had this one for as many years. Usually when we're in the classroom, we'll sit in a big circle and we'll pass them around, and then some of the twigs and things fall off. This one has some vines. Can you see the little twisty parts of the vines there? But it's very loosely put together. So if I shook it really hard, it would fall apart. So we're not going to do that. We're going to take care of it. But there's a little space in the middle there that's kind of deeper, where the eggs sat at one time. And then I have another kind of nest that I think is a robin's nest. And these are made not only with twigs, but also with mud. Now I can't confirm it because I just don't really know that they're a robin's nest, and I don't really know that this is a cardinal nest, but when I looked it up online, I was able to find some that look like this, and so I figured that's probably what they are, especially because we have them here. But this one has mud kind of around the outside of it, and there's grasses and things that are woven in there. And then if you look on the inside, the pocket of the nest on the inside is a little bit deeper than this other kind of nest. And this one, look here, there's a little bit of plastic on there. So whatever they picked up out of the yard, there was a little bit of trash or plastic in the yard. And that's what that one looks like. put together with mud. Here's another one that I want to show you that is similar to that one. This one has mud around the outside of it, along with grass on the inside, and a little bit of moss. I have moss that's actually outgrowing in my yard too, because it's so shady. We don't have a whole lot of sunlight in the yard, and usually in places where there's not a lot of sunlight, moss might start to grow. And then I want to show you this right here. What do you think these little indentations are on the side? You see how my fingers can fit right in there? What do you think that's from? I think it's from where the nest was built in the tree. And so a tree limb was probably here, and another tree limb was here, and then the bottom of the nest kind of sat down in between two tree limbs like that. That's kind of cool, huh? Then I have one more that I want to show you that's also a mud nest, although the shape of this one is pretty much perfectly round, and these parts have fallen off of it. This looks like, I don't know, maybe a dryer sheet. You think, Maggie, maybe a dryer sheet? And then look, here's a little piece of ribbon that was out in the yard from somebody's present, maybe a birthday present or a Christmas present. This also has the little rungs where it might have been up in the tree, or the little indentations, I guess. And on the inside of this one, can you see it? Maybe I'll turn it around. Do you see that? There's like a fake fingernail in there.
Ew!
So these birds, when they're building their nest, they just gather things from the yard, and I guess that was in somebody's yard. All of these nests were given to me by other people. None of them are nests actually from my yard. But if you notice here, there's a little bit of moss in this one, and then some long dried grasses. And again, it's muddy on the inside. This whole part was built with mud, nice and sturdy. And unlike these, where there's mud on the outside, this one has grass on the outside. And if you see, this is not perfectly round, but yet the cup on the inside of this one is perfectly round. So I wonder if they're not two different kinds of birds that build a mud nest. I'm not sure, but I think they're pretty cool either way. It's kind of nice to have, to show and to look at. Now I have another nest that's at my house, and do you want to film that one up there, Maggie? If you'll come and look up here, there's a couple of places at my house where the birds will build nests on top of a light fixture like this. And the nice thing about it is that this is under like a little roof area, so it keeps the nest out of the wind and the rain, right? The three of them actually are around the house. There's one by the front door, there's one here by the back door, and then there's one in the back of the house that is built. If you focus it this way, Maggie, I can show. It's built kind of like right next to the house off of the downspout. So I think they're pretty smart and creative in how they build them. But that one up there, I don't know what kind of bird it is. I need to pay good attention when I see the mama and the daddy bird. They will come every year. That nest, I just leave it there, and they come every year, and they lay their eggs, and then they fly off once they're finished using the nest. But that one looks like it has a lot more moss around it, which probably was gathered from my yard, since there is a lot of moss in the yard. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about birds and bird nests and reading our story that was not a true story, but yet a fun story nevertheless. Have a lovely afternoon, and tune in again later. I'm sure we'll have some other fun things. Bye!